Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to The Napoleonicist. Today I'm joined by Rob Griffith, a reenactor, historical fiction writer, and most recently respected author of Riflemen, a history of the 5th Battalion, 60th Royal American Regiment, which was published by Hellion. We're going to explore the question of the forgotten riflemen, the men of the 5th 60th, who had the same equipment and were given the same tasks as their more famous comrades in the 95th Rifles, who, until Rob's book came out, hadn't been given the attention they deserved. Rob, it's great to have you on The Napoleonicist. How have you been doing?
Yeah, pretty good, thank you. And thanks for asking me on. You know, it's great to talk to you.
No, it's a pleasure. I mean, I do want to say that despite you being one of the very generous Patreon supporters of the podcast, that isn't why you're here. I do want to The Riflemen of the 5th 60th probably aren't well known to our listeners, and they're certainly less likely to be familiar with them than their comrades in the army of the 95th Rifles. So to give everyone a flavour of their service, first of all.
Okay, so the 60th Regiment as a whole was formed during the 7 Years' War as the Royal American Regiment, and it was formed specifically to fight the French in the forests of North America, where the sort of the traditional line tactics of the British infantry weren't working against the French and their Native American allies. So they were formed from the outset as light infantry, and they were mainly recruited from Swiss and German settlers, from Swiss and Germans on the continent, and from British units. And they served throughout the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, and through into the Revolutionary Wars, mostly in North America, which included Canada and the West Indies. At the outbreak of war with France in 1793, the British Army was severely under strength, and it also had a severe weakness in light infantry. And so the Duke of York, who was commander-in-chief, got lots of emigre officers, French and German and Swiss officers who'd been either in fighting the French or in French royalist units, to form regiments for the British Army. And a lot of these were put into the West Indies because that's where they needed lots of light infantry, because we might think the West Indies is nice beaches and a place for holiday, but you go into the interior, it's mountainous, it's jungles, and you need light infantry there. You can't fight in the line battles, etc. So a lot of these units were sent to the West Indies, and like all troops in the West Indies at the time, they got decimated by yellow fever and other diseases. And so by 1797, a lot of these units were down to like a couple hundred men. And so it's decided to save money by disbanding all those regiments and putting the troops into the 60th. And the Duke of York had seen some of these troops in the Low Countries. A lot of them were armed with rifles. And he decided to form a 5th Battalion of the 60th, which exclusively armed with rifles. And so they came into being in December 1797. A couple of companies served during the Irish Rebellion, and then they served in the West Indies and Nova Scotia. And by 1807, they were getting prepared for another mission to South America, when suddenly the Spanish revolted against French rule, and the expedition changed its destination from Venezuela to Portugal. And so the 1808 expedition under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the 5th 60th formed the majority of the rifle troops there. There's only 4 companies of the 95th and 10 companies of the 5th 60th. And the 5th 60th then fought throughout the Peninsular War. They were one of only 3 battalions to be there from the start to the finish. They, unlike the 95th, who fought mostly in the light division and as a battalion, the 5th 60th was split up into individual companies and placed with the various brigades. This gave each brigade commander specialist rifle troops, and also boosted their numbers of light infantry. And the 5th 60th worked with the 3 light companies from the brigade to form a sort of a specialist light infantry battalion. And so each brigade commander would have this, 4 companies of light infantry, and they're quite often formed into divisional size units as well. The 3rd division and did that a lot. And because they're so split up, they basically fought in all the battles. There's 1 or 2 light division only battles where they weren't there, but they were all throughout the campaign. They won 16 battle honours, and they were basically everywhere, which obviously made the book a little bit challenging. For my first history book, I basically had to write a history of the Peninsular War as well. They were frequently praised by Wellington, and they were at the forefront of most of the battles.
What drew you to want to write about them then?
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, I had been writing historical fiction set in the period. My character was a spy for the Alien Office, which is the main British spy agency at the time. And I wanted to get some kind of more hands-on experience with the uniforms and the weapons. And so I started looking for a living history group. And, there are lots of living history groups, based in the period in the UK. There are redcoat units, cavalry units, whatever. And surprisingly enough, at least 4 95th units I can think of. But I wanted to be something a bit different, and the 5th 60th had an interesting history. And most of the members were local to me in the Midlands. So I joined the 5th 60th, and probably about 6 months after I joined, the unit was approached by Andrew Bamford, who is the series editor for Hellion, and he actually fights for the French. And he approached the unit and said, "Look, is there anybody who wants to write a history, because it's an interesting unit?" And I was put forward because I had writing experience, and haven't looked back since. Really, it's been a fascinating. I never thought I'd be writing history. I've really loved it though.
I mean, I have to say, you also write it very well, which is why it's a pleasure to have you on this. I've been thinking about doing this interview for a while. I can't believe it's taken me this long. I mean, I'm very interested in the fact that you approach this from a couple of perspectives that perhaps traditional, inverted commas, traditional historians wouldn't, in that you have that reenactment experience, which means that you perhaps appreciate some of the realities of fighting in a way that a lot of us can't. So what was the reality of life as a rifleman? Because there are a lot of misconceptions off the back of Sharp, but there are also misconceptions about the everyday life of the soldier during this period. So kind of help people to deconstruct that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of a bit careful not to bring too much of the reenactment experience into it, because just doing it, as a guy in my 50s, just hanging out with loads of blokes, drinking beer and firing guns at the weekend isn't quite the same thing as living through a campaign. So there were large elements of it that I sort of had to, not assume that what we did as reenactors was anything close to what they did in real life. It is very different. But yeah, there are a few things like, you know, the old argument about column versus line. You know, if you've ever tried to keep just 100 blokes in line across rough ground, you can see why they're actually always attacked in column. You know, so things like that you can get a bit of appreciation for. But in terms of the everyday life, you know, it was extremely hard. I think, you know, even though I found little evidence of it, I think being broken up into companies must have made their life harder, because you would not have that regular kind of support network of the regiment. So the regimental quartermaster, regimental surgeons, you know, the 5th, 60th companies, apart from the ones in the 3rd Division who had their headquarters, they were all, you know, split away from that, and so they would have had to rely on the senior regiment of the brigade for their surgeon and that kind of thing. You know, Sharp, you know, portrays Riflemen as kind of a proto SAS, you know, doing special missions and stuff, and you know, that wasn't the life of the Riflemen. You know, they were light troops supporting their brigade. You know, the brigade was a tactical unit, and you know, when the brigade marched, the rifle company would often form the advance guard, so they would be having to not march along the road, but marching on the flanks through the hills and that type of thing, you know, making sure the French weren't going to surprise, you know, the column. You know, in battle, they would be typically deployed ahead of the brigade or maybe on the flanks. And so as the French approached, they would target the officers, officially to break up the command and control, so that you know, when the French columns tried to redeploy, they didn't have the officers there and that kind of thing. But also, there's lots of accounts of them actually targeting the officers so they could go and plunder them as well. You know, because obviously, you know, there's much richer pickings on an officer. There are lots of comments about how the 5th, 60th were a little bit better prepared for campaign life than some of the redcoat units, which is you know, I found interesting. You know, one great account about how they always cooked better. You know, and you know, they always made more of the rations, you know, than the typical boiled beef, you know, that the Brits did. So you know, there's all that kind of thing, and just generally, you know, especially, you know, for the guys who are out there for 5.5 years, you know, it was a very long campaign, and so there was a lot of attrition from disease and illness, and you know, people being invalided back. You know, it wasn't the kind of, you know, let's go behind enemy lines and rescue the damsel of the week. You know, it was a very different life.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I'm curious about the fact that, as you said at the start of this, they've served in the West Indies. So is there a sense that they're actually a little bit more seasoned? For people who aren't familiar, the West Indies was essentially a death sentence. In fact, what they would often do is transport convicted soldiers to West India units, or they garrisoned it with slave units, because Westerners who were sent out there just dropped, and it's a horrible phrase, but they dropped like flies from disease. So these guys who have served in the West Indies, is there a sense that they're kind of slightly more battle hardened, which enables the unit as a whole to stay out for the entirety, where others have such kind of catastrophic attritional losses that they get sent back home?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a factor of that. You know, if you survived the West Indies, you know, Spain and Portugal was probably a bit of a holiday. But also, as the unit got replaced, you know, as people, you know, were killed or died of disease, the recruits they got were typically from either French prisoners of war or French deserters, and so they'd had at least one campaign already. You know, perhaps several more. I mean, there are guys who started off the war in one of the Royalist Swiss units, you know, got captured, volunteered for a British Swiss unit, and then went back to, were captured again with like French, fought for the French. You know, people who changed sides several times, and so I think on the whole they were much more experienced soldiers than the recruits from the militia that, you know, the British units were getting, you know, and that helped them, you know, to have a lower sickness rate. And also there's one of the surgeons notes that he's commenting about the King's German Legion, but he says they had a lower sickness rate because they drank less. You know, so
interesting.
You know, and obviously, you know, the very hard drinking a lot of the units did, you know, because it was a hard life, would affect their health. And also, again, the comments about them cooking better would improve their health. So there are various factors. I mean, it's very hard to draw any conclusions from a couple of anecdotes, but there is that evidence there.
It's interesting that you talk about recruitment, because that's where I wanted to kind of take the discussion next, because it's kind of problematic in some respects for the 5th, 60th that they are drawing in, when they need replacements, they're drawing in French deserters, because there is this whole kind of discussion about how good those deserters were. Because the point is that if you deserted from your original unit to then serve in a new surrogate unit on the other side, you don't have any loyalty to any side of the struggle. So you're just as likely to desert from your new unit, in this case the 5th, 60th, as you were from your original French unit. So what kind of an impact does that have on the kind of the longevity of kind of recruit retention?
Well, the first large swathe of prisoners to join the 5th, 60th actually was in Suriname in 1799. The battalion was part of an invasion of Suriname that took the colony, and in the colony was a Spanish unit called the Walloon Guards. And the Walloon Guards was a foreign regiment of the Spanish army, and these particular troops had been Hungarian and Austrian soldiers, had been captured by the French, sold to the Spanish, and sent to this Dutch colony. And
takes some tracking, doesn't it?
Exactly. And about 100 of these guys joined the 5th, 60th, and many of them carried on throughout the period. I mean, served like 20 years, and they seem to have served pretty loyally. I can trace guys back to the Walloon Guards who were dying at the Battle of Toulouse, right at the end of the wars. And obviously, some did desert, and but others didn't. So it's very difficult to come to any conclusion. There's the next big swathe of prisoners was from captured in a convoy that was going to the West Indies in 1806. So this is the French convoy going to resupply their West Indian colonies. It was captured by the Royal Navy, and again, about 100 of those guys volunteered. And those particular regiments were mostly recruited either in the Rhineland, and what is now Belgium, both areas that had recently come under French control. So the French had invaded the area. They had then, incorporated it as part of France and began, conscripting people. And obviously, it'd be like, people being conscripted from, German areas of Poland or something like that during the Second World War. Their loyalty would not have been to France. But again, lots of those people, did serve throughout the period. There's one guy called George Coaster, and he was from the Rhineland. He was taken on that convoy, and he rose to be a colour sergeant, and eventually retired about 1824, I think, and bought a pub in Montreal. So he had a huge career with the unit. So there was lots of people who did come from that background, who did serve loyally, but likely, but otherwise there was a French officer who volunteered for the 5th, 60th. He became a sergeant, and he joined about 1811 or 1810. He became a sergeant, but then he deserted during the retreat from Burgos, and was then recaptured again in the uniform of a French sergeant after the Battle of Vittoria, when he was tried and shot. The biggest issue they had, well, there are two real peaks of desertion. The first was during the advance into Spain under Sir John Moore.
The advance into Spain?
Into Spain, yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
There's a lot of assumption that Sir John Moore lost control of his army during the retreat.
Which isn't true. I mean, it's actually before that point that you really start to see things pick up in terms of desertions, isn't it?
Exactly. And about 100, maybe 120 of the 5th, 60th had deserted before they even got to Salamanca. But interestingly, about 3/4 of those men rejoined. So
Wow.
So it's not clear what exactly was going on. The regiment, the battalion was split into two wings, and one wing had a lot worse desertion problem than the other. and the 5th, 60th officers told Moore that they didn't trust their men, and they, and Moore decided to send them back into Portugal with the baggage. But as I said, most of those men rejoined. So it's more like that they were out marauding, scavenging for food or something. But there's a lot of letters, from Moore basically indicate he lost control of the army from an early stage. And
interesting. I didn't know it was that early. Because I know that you have issues before the Coruña retreat starts in very late December. Actually, in kind of the earlier part of December, things are really starting to fall apart, and he's starting to complain. But I didn't know that it was as early as just kind of getting into Spain.
Yeah, the sixth foot had a big problem, and Moore, I think, executed one of their guys and sent the 6th foot back into Portugal. But then when the 5th, 60th turned up and were in a worse state, they got sent to Portugal, and the 6th foot got brought back. So it's, I think, it's very easy to look at the figures for desertion and come to conclusions, but when you actually look into the individual cases, it's a very complex picture. There's a great series of, as you know, most of the trials of the ranks don't survive.
Yeah.
But there was a series of trials in 1806 while the 5th, 60th was still at Portsmouth. That it really illustrates how varied the reason for desertion is. I think there are 8 guys tried in 3 different trials. And the first trial, 4 guys went out to a pub, got drunk, slept over, and then realized in the morning that they were going to be in trouble, and decided rather than to face the consequences of being absent without leave, they might as well just run. And so,
the classic intoxication defense. Yeah.
Exactly. There was another guy who said he'd been tricked by the recruiting sergeant. So this is when they were still this is still when they were still recruiting from directly from Germany, and so recruits were brought over from Germany, and the recruiting sergeant basically convinced him to sign this piece of paper. The guy thought he was signing up for 7 years, but actually the recruiting sergeant got him to sign up for life, which gave the sergeant more bounty.
Yeah.
And this guy, he deserted from the 660th and then went to join the King's German Legion for 7 years. So he wanted to serve, just not for life.
But I'm sure he was quite happy to take the bounty money for both.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was another guy who was offered a job as a pastry chef in London, and so decided to leave. And there's another guy who was just very obviously a very young, inexperienced soldier he said he was led astray by someone else. And there's one guy who was involved in some kind of case of theft and decided to leave. And I think the last one was a guy who's pure, he seemed like the typical bad apple, and who just didn't want to serve, as was sick of the army and wanted to leave. So, but that's out of 8 people. There's a big variety of different sources there. I think the most unusual case I found for desertion was a guy who was washed away during river crossing during the pursuit after Oporto, because the 5th, 60th were one of the units that pursued salt across the Portuguese mountains. So this guy was swept away, during a crossing. I've got both, the entry in the pay book and an account from a officer of the 87th, I think. And so it's clear what happened to him, and he was marked dead. But then he turns up about 18 months later as a deserter. So he obviously survived and just didn't get back to the unit particularly quickly.
Interesting. Was he discovered? Because Northern Portugal, it's not an area where the army is particularly active.
Yeah, it's not clear at all.
Interesting.
Now that's the frustration, about these things. As you know, you get part of the story, but you never get all the story.
Completely. It's really interesting. I know we're talking a lot about desertion, but it is such an interesting topic, and it's brought up so neatly by the example of the 5th, 60th, because you've also got this phenomenon of the mercenary soldier during this period. Yeah. Well, in fairness, a little bit earlier, Ilya Berkovich has done a great book looking at this on motivation. in kind of the ancien regime armies, and he talks about how it wasn't actually that unusual for people to go from serving in one army to another and then back again. So there's this kind of hangover that's and kind of this whole notion of mercenary units is quite prevalent on the continent. So for a lot of these men who are recruited from continental, inverted commas, armies, I do wonder if there's just a slightly different philosophy going on that the British perhaps are less willing to accept.
Yeah, I think it's also that there's obviously a barrier to desertion, isn't there? That's the unknown. So if you look in British units in Ireland and what became Canada in the period, they have quite high desertion rates. Yeah. Because if you're a guy from the slums of Birmingham or whatever, and you end up in the big wide open spaces of Halifax and Nova Scotia, you can see how that's a very attractive thing, attractive place to live. They all speak English and that kind of thing. Whereas for the British troops in the peninsula, they had no idea what serving in the French army was like. They didn't know the language. But for the foreign troops, they often did know what serving in the French army was like, and so that there wasn't that barrier to making that change because they've done it once already, as you said. I also think one thing that isn't considered about desertion is mental health. One thing I was surprised when I was looking through the playbooks for the 560th, about once or twice a year there would be a suicide.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Really?
Yeah, and it will just, in the playbook, it will just say shot himself, and you've got to think, okay, well, that's obviously one form of desertion, fairly extreme one, but there has to be others who were suffering from, things like alcoholism and depression and post-traumatic stress, and so, that would be a factor in their choice of not deciding to go ahead. The book I've just written was an account of an officer of the 34th Foot, basically just leaving the front and being found on the way to Lisbon, in a state of undress and derangement, and he was, sent back to England for his health. But if he'd been an ordinary soldier, he'd have been marked up as deserting.
Yeah, I mean, there is that two-tier system going on there, isn't there, between how officers are treated and how the rank and file are treated. But it's interesting because there is a phenomenon of an insanity defense. It's something I've been looking at recently, and you do very occasionally get, in a way, intoxication is an example of kind of a diminished responsibility defense. So although it's not true mental health as we understand it, they're trying to say, look, I wasn't in charge of my actions. But very occasionally get individuals who say, half the time I'm not what's the phrase they use? I'm not in a clear state of mind. So it's an interesting kind of turn of phrase, and the courts take it very seriously, and they really kind of drill down into investigating whether or not there's truth there, which shows that the courts do, I don't know whether they have sympathy for it, but they do take such a plea seriously. But the flip side to this is that quite often these defences are put forward by the rank and file, because I don't think officers are ever tried for desertion. They might occasionally be tried for absence. And being rank and file, they don't have the education and the connections to be able to put together really strong cases for their defense. And as a result, what you find is that they put forward these insanity pleas, but they can't bring forward the witnesses to back up those insanity pleas. And so the whole thing falls apart. But yeah, it's an interesting point.
I mean, there's always this temptation to think of mental health as something new. Whereas there's obvious cases of shell shock and whatever in both world wars, and there's no reason to think that serving 5.5 years through a campaign, even though the actual action was fairly spaced out, it would still be a very trying experience.
Absolutely, and the losses are constant because you've got people dying from disease, or in fact more dying from disease than are from battlefield casualties. So if you're not traumatized by the gore of battle, then you are still kind of suffering from the after effects of depression from the fact that your comrades, who you are spending your entire time with, are dropping through illness. Yeah,
I mean, there's times that like 20 or 30% of a battalion would die in a few months, isn't there? So
yeah. I mean, there are some real characters in this unit as well, which your book draws out really nicely. So tell us about some of the officers and the rank and file that you in effect brought back to life through your research.
One of my favourites has got to be Johann Schwalbach. When the battalion landed in Portugal in 1808, he was a corporal, and he got to be General Fane's orderly. So General Fane was the brigade commander of the brigade that the 60th were in. And Schwalbach features in the memoir of a Royal Engineers officer called Landman. It's a very good memoir. And he basically features for being able to scrounge wine for General Fane very effectively. So there's a couple of wonderful passages about him scrounging wine from various places. But during the Battle of Vimeiro, he was with his general and helped to capture a French cannon that was trying to flee from the battle. And soon after that, and I don't know whether it's because he was good at getting wine or because he captured a cannon, but he was commissioned into the Portuguese service.
Wow!
And so he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Caçadores, and he served with, I think it was the 6th Caçadores throughout the Peninsular War, and rose to captain. And he stayed with the Portuguese armies after the war, and eventually rose to be a general and a viscount.
Wow, that's a hell of a story, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a hell of a career for a rifleman. Another good one is Peter Blassiere. Captain Peter Blassiere was a company commander in the 2nd Division, and he's the first rifle officer I know of to appear in a novel. So he beat Sharp by a good 150 years. There was an officer of the 92nd, the Gordon Highlanders, whose son was a famous Victorian novelist. And this guy wrote a book, which is basically a novelization of his father's war service, and in the 92nd Gordon Highlanders. So Blassiere is a character in the book, and he's a very taciturn, pipe-smoking, cabbage-eating German. Some quite nice descriptions in there. What's nice is that Captain Patterson of the 50th left another really detailed description of the real Blassiere. And, again, that goes into wonderful detail as to how tatty his uniform is, how he never took it off, but how he was always there as a rifleman, So, you get the real kind of impression of Captain Fredrickson from Sharp. Yeah, a real old soldier, whose men are dirty, but the rifles are clean,
Completely.
Yeah, and it was quite depressing, reading through the campaign and finding out that guy had died in 1814 at the very end of the campaign. He survived for 5 years and then was killed in a small skirmish. There's another guy, which is again shows the kind of good luck you sometimes get in research. He is called Louis von Ingersleben. So he was a Prussian officer. And in 1807, when the French army defeated the Prussians and forced the disbandment of most of the Prussian army, he came over to the UK, joined the 5th 60th. And at Albuera, he was severely wounded and went back to the UK to recover. And I was going through the outbook of the foreign depot, and the foreign depot was a depot in the UK which dealt with all the foreign units. And the commandant of the depot was writing to the CEO of the 5th 60th saying, look, I've been approached by this doctor who says Ingersleben left without paying his bill and left in a state of derangement. So, I was sitting there in the reading room of the National Archives, and I thought, oh, because I had the doctor's name and where he practiced, the name of his house. So I just Googled it. And it turns out it was an insane asylum.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this doctor was one of the first kind of really enlightened doctors treating insanity, and his house in Wiltshire was, there's an 1830 prospectus basically saying it's an oasis of calm. It's basically a nice country house, where the inmates were encouraged to exercise and that kind of thing. It's a nice, peaceful environment. So Ingersleben had obviously been wounded at Albuera, and it affected him mentally as well. And
Did he have a head wound?
It's not clear. He was severely wounded, but it's not clear. But he went back to the battalion, and in 1813, he was court-martialed. And he was court-martialed for a fairly petty dispute about where to stable his horse. So the two officers basically arguing about who had rights to the stable. But reading the transcript, you do get an impression that he turned to anger pretty quickly. So again, there's no basis for this, but it's tempting to think he was still suffering from PTSD.
Interesting. Yeah. The reason that I raised had he had a head wound was because I've been going through, as I said, kind of insanity defenses and cases where insanity has an impact. And one of the things that they do seem to be conscious of is that an injury to the head can lead to what we would now recognize as traumatic brain injury, which can therefore have, an impact on personality traits and so on. So like you say, it sounds like certainly whatever the wound was, he had some kind of after effect from it.
Yeah, I mean, he then left the battalion to go to the 2nd KGL Lights and fought with them at Waterloo. So he had still had a long career. But the longest serving officer was a guy called Jean-Pierre Galiffe. And again, this really illustrates the life of some of these officers who'd come from the continent. At the outbreak of the revolution, he was serving in one of the Swiss regiments in French service. And after the king got executed, the whole regiment marched out of the barracks and went to the Royalist armies. Jean-Pierre went back to Geneva, where he was from, and defended Geneva against the French. But then, he's one of the few set of letters that I've got from the battalion. There's no memoirs from the battalion, and there's only a couple of sets of letters. And I've got a letter from Galiffe, to his father, basically saying, look, all I know is how to soldier. I had a good career in France. I'm not going to be a merchant like you want me to. I'm going back to the army. And he actually went to the Dutch service first, served in the Red Hussars, and then joined the York Rangers and British service, which were, and then when the 5th 60th were formed, he joined them. So throughout the period, and when the battalion landed in Portugal, he was a brevet major and ended up commanding the battalion. Towards the end of the war, he had 15 clasps to his various campaign medals. So he's one of the few officers to serve both at Fuentes Sonoro and Albuera.
That's not a service record that you particularly want, because your odds wouldn't be particularly good, would they?
No,
I mean,
exactly.
neither was a great affair, particularly at Albuera, obviously.
But he served with the battalion from formation through to the last month, before they were disbanded. And interestingly, if he hadn't survived the wars, my kids wouldn't exist. Because his descendant, Rodney Galiffe, because the Galiffe family went on to serve the British Army throughout the Victorian period, mostly in India. And Rodney Galiffe lives quite near me, and he formed a flying school And in the 1990s, he decided to get air cadets learning to fly, and my wife was one of the first students, and only came to this area because of the flying scholarship, and saw a job advertised, which I then interviewed her for, and we've ended up getting married and having kids. But if Rodney Gleif hadn't existed because his great grandfather had died, that wouldn't have happened.
How incredible is that? I love that. I absolutely love that. I mean,
and it's I only got to know Rodney, once I started writing the book and doing the research. And as I said, John Gleif's letters are one of the few ones I get. Frustratingly, not that many from the Peninsula, but Rodney remembers playing with his Peninsular War journal when he was a kid. But it's now gone missing somewhere in the family.
Oh no! How awful is that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible that you've got your own kind of personal connection to these guys.
Exactly.
That kind of the winds of fate elements of things. That, you've got no way of knowing that these things happen, but they just do.
Yeah.
What are the wider attitudes of the army then to this unit? I mean, let's start with Wellington. Wellington, I mean, we've touched on some of Wellington's attitudes in a sense already, haven't we? Lack of tolerance for desertion, well, that's an army-wide thing, but Wellington not being somebody who's fussed so much about clothing as, the troops actually being able to fight properly when required on campaign. So did he like the 5th, 60th? Did he recognise them? Or did they kind of get forgotten because they're split up into these different brigades?
I only found one direct comment on them, and that was when Wellington was replying to one of the brigade commanders, and basically the brigade commander had praised the company that was attached to his brigade, and Wellington wrote back saying, yes, that chimes with everything I've heard about that excellent corps. And certainly he must have had some confidence in them, because even though they did have the typical problem with desertion, they were left being in there, split into the companies. They weren't, you think if you're having a problem with a unit, you'd get it back together rather than keeping it split up. But no, they're from 1810 onwards, the companies never got back together again. So he must have had some confidence in them, as you say, in his dispatches and that kind of thing. They're often not praised individually because they were part of the light companies. You quite often see in reports of battles, the light companies went forward. Well, that would have been the light companies plus the rifle company, but they're not individually mentioned. And it can be quite hard to trace what the individual companies were actually doing. Often I only knew they took part in the battle because of the casualties, on that day. In the wider army, I've not heard seen anything apart from John Moore's comments after they deserted, saying that they should be disbanded and sent to the colonies. I've not heard anything negative. There's several comments from officers who were in brigades with them, saying that they helped raise the standard of the light companies because these are specialist light company troops. And for example, an officer of the 32nd says that they were very much better at using cover and not just standing out in the middle of nowhere firing at the French. The Germans would use cover appropriately and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth kind of, for all that we've talked about desertion, kind of rehabilitating their reputation slightly as deserters, because these are not the chasses Britannique, which just hemorrhaged men through desertion at the rate of sort of 100 a month. For a significant period of time.
I think one factor that perhaps helped was that the commandant of the foreign depot was a former 60th officer, and there's quite a few letters that basically saying that he was hand picking the troops for them. But there again, he says that to the Brunswickers and other people as well. But there is some element of selection in the foreign recruits, which perhaps isn't the case with other British units. Because the recruiting party would just get whatever it got, whereas with recruiting from a depot, you have a chance to push officers into push for the officers to push men into certain units.
I mean, there is a phenomenon across all of the foreign units of having higher desertion rates than the let's call them inverted commas, British units. King's German Legion, widely respected, but still had what you might call significant desertion rates. But all of these numbers are in broader terms quite small. So KGL, I don't think ever peaks above an average of 2 desertions a month. Obviously, it varies from month to month across a campaign and so on. But if you average it out across their period of service, I think for them it's under 2 a month. For the life of me, I can't remember what it is for the 5th, 60th.
I mean, I didn't like compile the figures, but my impression was going through the pay books and whatever. You might have like 3 or 4 a month, but often you had 1 or 2 coming back as well. So it's not a clear picture.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is always the thing. Where does the line lie between absence and desertion? Because if these men are coming back, are they coming back under armed guard, i.e. they're forced to come back, or do they come back voluntarily? Because if they come back voluntarily, then the intent to desert probably isn't there as much as it is for those who physically go and join the opposing side. I mean, the other interesting one that I think people don't like me saying this, the 1st 95th, they always get very angry, fans of the Rifles, when I say this, but the 1st 95th had one of the worst kind of desertion rates. It wasn't the worst by any means, but it wasn't great either. I think they average out at 1.2 a month, which is higher than a number of the other kind of British inverted commas units that are serving alongside them. So for all that we can kind of sit in judgment, actually even our perceptions of the 1st 95th as kind of the elite rifles perhaps needs just a bit of tempering and a bit of kind of injection of realism beyond what we see in Sharp, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think it's in either in Surtees' memoir or Harris. There's a bit where some of the Irish recruits go and attack the colonel's daughter or something. They were no less prone to being rogues as anyone else.
Exactly. Lower down the ranks, what's the attitude towards the 5th, 60th? Because there's this, and I'm talking here about kind of rank and file captains, etc. Because there is a resistance sometimes to foreign inverted commas troops, which is often dependent on what people see. So if you talk about the Portuguese, that's completely tied up with whether or not the individual had a bad experience serving alongside Portuguese troops. With the Spanish, perhaps more of an inclination to be scathing. What's the stance with the 5th, 60th? Did you pick up on a kind of a prejudice, or is it more of an acceptance?
No, I didn't come across anything that negative, certainly. As you know, a lot of the memoirs are very focused on their particular unit, and you could be forgiven for thinking that their battalion was operating on their own, and there was not even the other units in the brigade are mentioned. Quite often the 60th are mentioned in relation to plundering. There's several accounts of them, as I said, picking off French officers and that type of thing. But I think my impression is, like the King's German Legion, they were widely accepted and respected, and seemed to be on a par with the British troops.
I have to ask about the research process behind all of this, because I mean, regimental histories, they were quite common. Certainly my perception as a researcher is that they were much more common in the first half, or perhaps even the first 3/4 of the 20th century, and then kind of faded off a bit as people started to focus more on kind of social history rather than kind of narrative history. So, and there are exceptions to that, obviously, but for the most part, you don't tend to see regimental histories anymore. So what was the research process like? Because did you find yourself kind of having to discover a new art in terms of weaving this story together, or was it just that you were writing your first history book, if you will, as opposed to your novels, and so it was kind of all a learning curve?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I didn't know any better. So there have been 2 previous histories, one called Swift and Bold, written in the Victorian period, and another part of the Annals of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, which was published in 1920. But like most of those Victorian, early 20th century histories, they very much are the officers, focused on the officers. So I had a rough basis from that. But obviously Google was my friend. Once I started Googling stuff, I found letters of an officer called James Prevost. His letters are in an archive in Albany, New York. So I got those sent over as digital files. John Galief's letters are in archive in Geneva, so I got those. But then it was just, going through the records in the National Archives. I mean, if I'd been writing a history of the 95th, you've got like 20 different memoirs to work with. And so to an extent, because I didn't have those memoirs, I had to work a bit harder. And I think the book's probably better for it, because, going through the regimental returns, the pay books, you just get these little stories of, guys who, shot themselves or, deserted or, just, and it's just, I think, having been a novelist, a historical novelist, you do kind of get used to weaving a story around the facts. And, that helped me, make a narrative out of these little snippets of information and join them together to hopefully present the story of the unit quite well, But it was just a lot of hard work. I basically did it full time for about 18 months, for which is not going to earn me very much money. It was quite a commitment, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, being a historian is not a route to vast wealth, that's for sure, but it sure can be fun. Tell us a little bit about what happens to the 5th, 60th after the Napoleonic Wars.
Well, at the end of the Peninsular War, they were down to about 250 men, and they were sent back to Cork. And obviously, with the end of the war, they lost their recruiting ground of prisoners of war and deserters. And so they remained under strength for a fair while. They were too under strength for the Waterloo campaign. And it's only when the King's German Legion got disbanded in 1816, and a lot of those guys transferred over into the 5th, 60th, that they actually came back up to numbers. They were then stationed in Gibraltar for a few years, and then as the army wound down, the battalions of there were 8 battalions of the 60th at the end of the war, and gradually they got disbanded, and the 5th, 60th were disbanded in the Isle of Wight in 1818. Most of the men went to the other battalions and carried on serving with those, and then eventually all the foreigners were forced out in the 1820s, and it became the Duke of York's Rifle Corps, and then the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and then late in the 20th century it was merged into the Royal Green Jackets and now the Rifles Regiment.
So when you talk about the foreign troops being forced out, was that a kind of a thing of nationalism and prejudice against foreign troops, or were there other motivations for that?
Yeah, it seems to have been a fairly acrimonious process. There's a file in the National Archives of letters from people saying, okay, well, you're forcing me out, but what about my pension? And that type of thing. So I think it was just to make it into a British regiment rather than a foreign corps. By that time there were large numbers of British troops in there already, but they were just, as I said, forced out. Many of them would have been coming to the end of their service anyway. But it just seemed quite sad.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us about your other work though, because you're not done by any means.
No, not at all. I have the bug now. I've completed a book on the battles of Aromelinos and Almaraz, which are 2 small battles of General Hill, who commanded a separate force in the south for large periods of the Peninsular War. And that was actually ready. It should have been published, beginning of this year, but COVID has delayed it, and it should be out in January next year now, I think. But that's quite interesting because they're 2 small battles that haven't been studied before individually. They get they get a couple of paragraphs in a man and that type of thing. But they are quite good because it's basically the same British units in both. So I was able to carry on using regimental returns and regimental inspections and that stuff to give quite a good idea of the character of the units and lots of nice little details. which you can't do if you're doing a Salamanca with several thousand troops. So that was quite fun, and also General Hill is a lovely character. These days where the US and the UK are both run by people you might not want your children getting married to, to find someone from history who was a really nice bloke, who no one had a bad word to say about him, and he was he's known as Daddy Hill, but actually these two battles also show him as quite a hard soldier. He was happy to drive his men really hard to achieve the aim and to take risks. So that was quite fun, and Hill, General Hill's from Shropshire, where I was born as well, so that was quite nice.
Has there been a biography of Hill for a while? Because I feel a decent biography, a kind of a Rory Muir style assessment of his life.
There's one by a military historian called, the first one was a Victorian, typical Victorian puff piece by a guy called Sidney, which is useful for having all the correspondence in there, but it's not a proper biography. Then there, in the 80s or 90s, I think it was, a military historian called Tefitella did one, which is good on the military side, but like a lot of those books in the 80s, they didn't have the resources we have of being able to search digital archives and that type of thing. And then I think one of his descendants wrote one more recently, and that's better on the family side, but not very good on the military. So you're right, it could do with a good one, but that depends on my editor.
I was going to say, there's a future project for you.
Yes, eventually maybe. I'm currently working on a history of the 1808 campaign in Portugal. So that's that's my my current project. But I will carry on writing history. It's a it's a great hobby to have. And also the one thing that makes it is the great community we've got of historians. One thing that kept us all going through lockdown is the little knot of historians we have on Twitter. Really good conversations between them, and also very willing to help. I had an email from a mutual friend, Eamon, the other day. Helped him out with something. I've asked you for stuff in the past. And everyone's happy to share. Which is very nice.
Absolutely, it's a great little community, and it's fun to be a part of it, I have to say. Rob, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me on the Napoleon Assist.
Thank you.
That was Rob Griffith joining me to discuss the forgotten riflemen of the 5th Battalion, 60th Regiment. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob_Griffith_, and his titles on the 5th, 60th and the battles of Almarath and Arroyo Molinos are available to order from hellion.co.uk. As you heard, Rob is one of the incredibly generous people who supports the Napoleon Assist on Patreon. That's not why I interviewed him, as you heard. He's very knowledgeable and his research is really interesting. If you are interested in becoming a patron, helping to cover the production costs of this podcast, you can find out more at patreon.com/the Napoleon Assist. Prices start from £1 a month, and there are neat perks including shout-outs in the credits and exclusive opportunities. If you would rather not part with your money, I completely understand. But please do take a couple of moments to spread the word. Hit the like, retweet and share buttons on social media, leave a review or follow the podcast on your preferred platform, and join the conversation online. On Twitter you'll find me at ZWhiteHistory, and of course there's the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. A big thank you to everyone who has helped to spread the word, and particular thank you to my mentioned in dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Alex Churchill, an anonymous Canadian, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Anna Vakulenko, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Rory Muir, and James Bevan. Join me next time when I'll be doing a talk on how the British newspapers reported on the Peninsular War and what that can tell us about popular attitudes towards the conflict. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleon Assist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, socially distance where you can, keep being kind to one another, and as always, Thank you for listening.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.